Hey, everybody. Good everything. Good afternoon. Good evening. It is good to be here with you. You see me. I can't see you, but I know you are there. And I am, again, godly proud and pleased to be afforded the opportunity to use the airways, if you will, this technology to come to you and do what it is that I am enjoying doing, bringing you what we call relevant conversations with yours truly, me, Bishop John Selders. And tonight I have the distinct privilege and blessed honor to bring to the platform again. He's no newbie to this our platform and our show. He's not new to it. He is the senior minister of a congregation, a faith field congregation just east of us here, and community that I know really well and have been pleased and proud to be a part of and to share the work. He's my brother and my friend and colleague. Let me bring the Reverend Josh Pawelek to this platform. Good evening, brother.
Hey Bishop, how's it going? Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's always great.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have um, uh, there's not too many things over the last probably 20 plus years that somehow we haven't been in and around for whatever and the various reasons. We have been, as Congressman John Lewis says, we've been stirring good trouble up over those years.
That is right. That is right.
And I appreciate very much your willingness to come and join us tonight. We are in a moment, and so let me jump in and let's chop it up a little bit. This I'm been talking about over the last number of weeks. This idea of a conjectural analysis, conjecture, and this concept brought to us by Antonio Gramsci, who is a thinker, a political thinker, and an organizer, an activist, pre and during the time of the 1920s and 30s in Italy, right? And he talked about, and then later on, there are other scholars and thinkers that have been thinking about the questions and this idea of we're in a moment. You know, he was there, Mussolini, and then the Third Reich and that connection in Europe during the 1920s and 30s. He was writing and thinking and organizing, and was jailed for it, quite frankly. But he was exploring what does it mean to be in a moment. What does this moment mean? And I you know, some colleagues of mine have been talking about this in a wide variety of issues and systems and thinking about it. And I was like, well, what might those of us who do faith field work and do justice work, what might we contribute and to what this conjecture, right? And of course, for us, this role, this analysis, we would probably speak more faithfully to the idea of the prophets, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is the role of the prophet? Those of us who speak the words of the divine, who speak the words of God, you know, whatever the language you might use. And I think we have a role to play, and certainly in the work that we have carved out for ourselves as we have worked together with More Monday CT, as we have gotten arrested together, as we have stood in the halls of power here around Connecticut. We've been doing that work and continue in the ways, both in our congregational realities, but also within the context of our traditions and our faith community. how might we talk through and to this conjecture, this moment in time? And for me, I'll begin by saying there's you have to, if you have some spiritual rootedness, you sense there's something going on here.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Mm-hmm.
afoot. And don't we have a very interesting political national scene that got even more interesting, a few weeks ago. But let's begin. Respond to that and react to what I've just laid out.
So my understanding of that Gramscian conjunctural analysis is pretty limited, but my sense is you're looking at, or the analyst is looking at economic trends, political trends, social trends, and cultural trends in their moment. What has gotten them or us to where we are now? And so with Gramsci, he was looking at the rise of fascism, and you're right, he was imprisoned eventually. And I think that's Notes on Prison, or Notes from Prison, is one of his most influential works. And so the question is, what's happening now? He wouldn't want us to use his categories to understand our time now, but he'd want us to know what our categories are and what are the trends that have led us to where we are. And certainly the big thing that feels in many ways very different now than it did 20 years ago. I don't know that it is different, but it feels very different, is the rise of this far right, these far right movements, which are very clearly prepared to use violence. These far right movements that lie, allege fake news, that manipulate, that really show no remorse, no problem sleeping at night. Ties into the way the courts have been stacked with right-wing judges, particularly the Supreme Court, but certainly down the line. The way there's this constant call for tax cuts, and it really means tax cuts for the wealthy, which we know makes the wealthy wealthier. And it almost sounds cliche because it's so obvious, but makes poor people poorer. And we are still, since really what I would call the Reagan Revolution, dealing with the increase in wealth disparity in the United States. And certainly we see it in Connecticut. Connecticut has some of the worst wealth and income disparity by race and class and gender in the country. And so what's interesting to me is it's not always the right-wing haters. It's not always the Klan and the Proud Boys, but it's the people who steward the institutions. It's the supposedly liberal governor of Connecticut who loves these fiscal guardrails that don't allow the legislature to spend anything. Now, Bishop, I just lost you on the screen. Am I still there? Are you still there? I just lost you.
You're good. You're good. I'm just in the background.
Yeah. So this is actually one of the things I've been reflecting on a lot recently. Is you have the rise of these, for all intents and purposes, terrorists or terrorist wannabes, who are now threatening poll workers at our elections and that kind of thing. And then you have the stewards of our institutions, our legislators, our elected officials, our bankers, our CEOs, who don't have to resort to violence, don't have to make what are essentially crazy, unfactual statements. They just have to say, let's keep the status quo as it is, or let's not invest in public goods and services because that's not good for the fiscal health of the state. they can do a lot of harm simply by stewarding the institutions that govern society, and that in many ways we rely on. We want them there, but we want them to function in a certain way as progressives, as people who care about people. And so again, the tension for me is, do you address the violent tendencies on the right, or do you address these more mundane stewards of, I keep calling them the stewards of the institutions that are really in many ways doing more harm? And so I struggle with that, and we can go into that deeper if you want, but let me pause there.
Yeah, of course, I know what you're referencing and what you're speaking to. So let's go back 20 plus years ago, right? So probably one of our earliest overtures into what was happening in the civic Connecticut. So I'm gonna be very, very locally based for a moment. Was how to do what's right around the budget, the Connecticut state budget. And I remember a number of the things we were pulled together by some of our folk in labor around some tables. We had begun to think through and talk about how could we use our voice, and our presence to call for more just accountability, quite frankly, around how we spend money, how we do allocations and appropriations, right, at the state level. And then, of course, that certainly had some implications for any and all of us in our own local municipalities. Of course, at the time, 20 plus years ago, I didn't quite realize, because I wasn't from here, how parochial we are here in Connecticut. I came to understand that pretty clearly, and that we're not region-based at all for the most part. We have counties, so there's New Haven County, there's Hartford County, and New London County, Litchfield County. There's 6 counties here in the state of Connecticut. But whether there's
no structure, there's no governing body there. There have been historically, but those were removed really over a process that I think culminated in the 90s. Yeah, that's
right. And really, it's dog eat dog. For 169 towns who have, we have as many municipal departments in every single town as we have towns, right? And so there's all of that kind of structural, I was going to call it something else, that kind of structural gridlock. I'll call it that. I'm going to be nice today. I'm going to be nice tonight. That gums up the works, and very few folk who actually over time have, one, pay attention to what's happening both municipally and also to our state, and secondly, who have the fortitude, the resource, and the inclination to stay on top of stuff, so that you over time work a thing all the way out. And it is taken. It takes something. Fortitude is not even the word. It takes something to sit in that. And what you're naming is the struggle that any and all of us have who want to do what's right, who want to call for what, both in an accountability context, but also, in laying down what we think ought to happen. And I've been in those conversations. You've been in those conversations, multiple conversations over multiple years. And when we feel like we get a win, we take a step forward, we take 10 steps back, or we get lodged in gridlock. So at our state level, we got the long session and the short session. Not gonna get nothing done too much in the short sessions. And then there's a lot of meetings and a lot of, back and forth in the long sessions. And then there's the rush to the end, right? And I'll say the only different reality that we've experienced here recently was the 2020, the COVID year, when in fact the whole of the state, along with this country and the world, in fact, shut down for a minute. But we were able to do something pretty amazing in calling for the fast and really asking for something to happen even in that COVID moment. So it's been a very interesting road we have journeyed so far, and I appreciate you beginning where you began, because here we are now in this moment, that feels very different 20 years ago than here we are today, right? Where for all intents and purposes, Connecticut would be considered a blue state.
Oh yeah.
Yet, the dynamics of this blue state says that our urban centers, we have five larger urban centers here in Connecticut. We call them larger urban centers. And then you have, other slightly smaller urban centers where most of the persons of color and most of that blue, numerically live. But then there's a lot of red in some of the other spaces, and so it's very interesting, the politics of those spaces. You and I have done work in Waterbury. We've done work, in other spots in the state, and it's hard treading in some of those spots.
Oh yeah.
And we've spent significant time in some of those cities and towns. And yet here we are in this moment where what's on the right side of the house feels it's different. And I'll say that it's different.
So I remember it must have been in 2015, Donald Trump was candidate Trump, and he came to Connecticut. And I remember you called and said, should we be out there protesting him? Because there were a lot of people in our networks that were going to be out there trying to get in, trying to disrupt. People did. And I remember my response very clearly. I don't know if you do, but I said, no way. Don't give that guy, don't give him air to breathe. Don't give him attention. Don't ramp up his platform. And I think at the time, I still feel like that was the right thing. Like, let's not focus on this negative clown. Let's focus on doing what's right, within our power to move forward initiatives and campaigns that benefit people in Connecticut, that benefit poor people, that benefit people who need housing, that benefit people who need healthcare, that benefit people who need education. Let's keep focused on that. But what feels different now is that voice, that right-wing, hateful, violent voice feels it's unleashed. And I think you see it growing, and you keep hearing these reports from the FBI and other nonprofits that study it, how it's growing. I hear reports from colleagues in states like Idaho and Mississippi and Alabama, and Florida and Texas, where they really feel like they are behind enemy lines. And it's hard to do anything in terms of a social justice ministry or a service ministry that isn't somehow related to countering the anti-trans legislation or the disruption of school boards and the censorship of books or the burning of books. A lot of people, that's their ministry now, helping women leave the state who have a pregnancy that they cannot bring to term, but they're being told that they have to, and it's going to impact their life in incredibly negative ways. So in Connecticut, we're not quite there yet, relative to what it feels like to do ministry in Texas or Florida or Idaho. But I do wonder about both possibilities come November. What should we be preparing for if Donald Trump wins the election? But also, what should we be preparing for if he loses? Right? I think both both possibilities leave us in not necessarily a new place, because we've had a very violent past in the United States, but I think we're likely to see the kind of violence, maybe not in Connecticut, that is characteristic of 1910s, 1920s. That's what I worry about. That's what's keeping me up at night. So my answer to the question is not that I would go out and protest if Trump came to Connecticut, but I think part of our ministry really does have to be confronting the hatred. And I'm not exactly sure what that looks like. That's not completely familiar territory to me. I've done it. But that's what I'm wondering about, is what does that look like? And we need to be thinking about this now. I feel like I might be a little late to the game. I've been on vacation. I've been off the last couple of months. We've had a lot of deaths in the congregation, so I'm really focused on that. But I think we ought to be convening people, clergy and others, activists, just to say what are our plans? How are we going to hold together? How are we going to work together and provide aid to each other, and particularly aid to families and individuals who are likely to be punished? Like, especially if he wins, it's going to be punishing. And how do we respond?
Well, and let's add to that. In addition to, how are we prepared to respond as things get bleaker? And I'm not necessarily, suggesting doom and gloom.
Right.
But I think there is a reality that's one of my friends and colleagues has suggested to me that what they've said is we've already lost.
Yeah.
Because this for me is reminiscent of what would have been deemed back maybe in the 1970s as the cultural wars, or the 60s, right? The 60s into the 70s. And did we win? When I say we, I mean those of us who are on what I would call the political left of the discussion, the debate, the rise of a kind of radicality that's leaning politically, that's not inclusive, that's not embracing of what would have been, what we heretofore would have called affirmative action, right? The rolling back of the civil rights legislation that was passed in '65, the Voting Rights Act in particular, the individual rights and the dog whistle, if you will, of states' rights. So that goes further back than the turn of last century. Now we're talking about pre-Civil War.
Sure,
right?
That's what the argument was.
Right. And let's be real clear. Where there was movement afoot, and I'm going to go back 200 years ago, where there was movement afoot back then, that would have been the abolitionist movement. We would have been talking about slavery and getting rid of the enslavement period and the trade, which we did do. But all of that got birthed because there was what we now call the Second Great Awakening. So that there were religious leaders who understood that they had a role to play and a voice in the public square to add to what was already the narratives that were not only being shared and talked about and projected out. We had set up whole societies and government and policies that were based around that, and we undid some of that, only to have the gains of, let's say, 1865, the end of the Civil War. Reconstruction was afoot a decade, 2 decades later. By 3 decades after the end of the Civil War, 1865, by 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision that set in law a separate but equal. which we lived out for almost a whole nother 100 years, right? So what was ensconced and coded and codified in the law, you know, 3/5 humans, Black people were, by virtue of our own Constitution, which we then said, okay, we know that was bogus, right? So we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Isn't it funny that now the 14th Amendment is being used in part to justify, again, some craziness, right? That's not inclusive. That's not broadening who we are as in both individuals and collectively who we are as community, but it is being used to separate and even to segregate us even more and to bring barriers between us. I find this a very, very interesting moment. Very, very interesting moment for you and I to be standing, you know, in our, you know, literal pulpits, but also in the spaces of the public square, to say, okay, what should we be thinking about? What should we be angling for? What should we be preparing for within the context of both our faith communities, but also our broader communities? How are we using? So I like what you've begun to say. Are we calling each other together to say, hey, let's talk about what we might be leaning into and what we might be needing to think about?
Yeah, and there's so many ways, so many places to go with the conversation. I mean, certainly, I'm thinking of our good colleague over at Metropolitan Community Church, Aaron Miller, who's now Elder Aaron Miller. He's been elevated. And they're Trans Voices 365, and they're receiving what we call internally displaced refugees. So trans people, trans families who are moving out of some of these states where this really horrible legislation has happened. They're coming to Connecticut, and a lot of times they're leaving in the dead of night, and they need they don't have jobs, they don't have housing. So that's an incredible ministry, and I want to figure out how to support that. Certainly we're supporting it financially, but there may be other ways to get more deeply involved. And as I was saying earlier before we got on, I do think immigrants, maybe I said it earlier in this call, there's a way in which they're even undocumented people are being punished now, policy-wise, just by this incredible compromise that happened in Congress under the leadership of our own Senator Chris Murphy, where Republicans got, so much of what they've been asking for. Democrats got some in that too, but the line on immigration seems to have just vanished, and he makes no apologies for that. He says the whole point. I was in a meeting with him recently. The whole point was to get a bill that, if Congress passed it, would just take the teeth out of Donald Trump's campaign. So no wonder Trump scuttled it, right? Trump just said, no, this thing's DOA. But what it means is, regardless of who's elected in November, the things have changed for undocumented people. So that's one of the areas I think our ministries are really going to matter. And then one of the other things I'm focused on, and this has less to do with the national elections and more to do with Connecticut, again, is these fiscal guardrails in Connecticut that just keep the state from being able to invest. So we're drastically underfunding our higher education, the state university system. That impacts both of us. We both have children. You have a grandchild. I have a child who's going to start at Central Connecticut, and they're both walking into this, vastly underfunded school. I don't know what that's going to actually mean for them, but the state claims to not have the money. It does have the money. It has billions of dollars, but because of these fiscal guardrails, some of which are constitutional and some of which were enacted in 2017 and then re-upped in 2023. State cannot access money, so it can't invest in higher education the way it ought to be. It can't invest in K through 12 education the way it ought to be. It can't invest in housing. We have one of the worst housing crises in the country. And it gets really bad when you start looking at, not just what they call affordable housing, which is never affordable, but housing for low-income people, housing for people with disabilities, housing for elders on fixed incomes. There's virtually nothing new on the market. And our homeless population rose 13% last year. Something's got to be done about these fiscal guardrails. And I see it all on a continuum. The anti-trans stuff, the anti-immigrant stuff, the just blatantly racist and race-baiting diatribes that Donald Trump puts out there. You mentioned the dog whistles. He's speaking to the Black journalists, but he's not really speaking to the Black journalists. He's speaking to the Proud Boys and all his other followers, right? Just saying these heinous things. There's that, but then again, there's just the stewards of our institutions, the steward of our state budget, the steward of our Treasury, Office of Policy and Management, all these people who are just colluding to keep these structures in place that prevent us from doing what is right, from doing the just thing, from helping people, from investing in people. They say it's all about fiscal stability, but if you don't invest in people, if people don't have pathways to success, to economic achievement, to education, to healthcare, the state's going to pay for it later. This is not fiscal stability. This is fiscal lunacy. And I think as clergy, as prophets, we really got to call it out, all on that continuum. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, it's getting at it. And for me at least, and I know for you as well, this has been the lane we've operated in. I think we have been forward thinking about this, certainly thinking about the times both 20 years ago in relationship to I'm going to quote New Testament Christian scripture. Jesus said it like this, paraphrase: "Where your treasure is, that's where your heart is."
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so it seems to me that what you value, you put 5 on it, as the kids might say today. And quite frankly, we see where the value is. It's not in people. The value is in let's say this. It's not in some people.
Right.
Because I think some other people seem to get what makes it feel good and what works for them. And that can be said in many different ways based on the decisions that get made. You can pick one, pick a thing that has happened. Downtown Hartford, for example, benefited greatly from the arrival of a certain sports franchise. And the building of a certain, place where they do their sporting.
Sounds like you can't say the word.
And yet, when I asked the question of those who were, of folk, I said, like, the people we elected, y'all elected, supported that. What has that done for you in your own neighborhood? What has your own community been beneficiary to that?
Virtually nothing, as far as I can tell. There's some people who live in the community who are vendors, like sell popcorn and hot dogs and stuff.
Yeah, they sure getting rich doing that. Thanks.
But I know you know this, but when they first started building that stadium, there were all these, built into the contracts, these economic benefits for the community, and there were a certain amount of jobs for what they call minority contractors. And it was crazy to watch them hire these minority contractors and people from the city, and then they'd work for 2 months and then they'd be let go, and they'd say, well, we fulfilled the contract. It was rude and insulting and painful.
Yeah.
And so
It
that's
was.
why I think you can't say the word because it's too traumatic. We go back.
It is, and we did our part to play to lift up the concerns that we had, and so I reference that example as to say that we've spent time here before,
Yeah.
and here we are. I mean, this is the lane we operate. There's certain venues, there's certain avenues that we travel. And here we are again, and I think the stakes are even higher than they were, say, 20 years ago. The way in which January 6th, if it didn't say anything, and it said a whole lot, but it should have turned our attention to the fact that in that kind of quick, we could be in another kind of situation that we never would have thought. We thought we were at the end of that kind of striving and rivalry and warring between us. And again, I'm not trying to be the prophet of doom and gloom, but I do want to say, and here's where I want to pivot a bit in our remaining few minutes. I think there is the possibility of us establishing some precedent. Here's what I would like to see happen, and then calling for that to emerge, not just in the political arena. I think we could call for a kind of hope-filled, love-based activism, if you will. Doing more what you've named. My buddy who said to me, Bishop, I think we've already lost. So what he pivoted to say that then in response to what I think has already occurred, we need to be creating these cities of refuge, if you will. Use that metaphorically. We ought to be using our buildings in faith communities. We ought to be to gather folk to say, okay, here's a place of regard. Here's a place of acceptance. Here's a place to nurture and love on each other and your loved ones. And let's weather this storm. Debbie just came through here, right? And we felt the effects of it. And so you shelter in place. I used to live in Florida for a while. And when those storms came through, you got on out of the way of those storms until they passed over. The storm is passing over. Hallelujah. A Negro spiritualist gospel writer penned it many, many years ago. It is how are we calling for us to lean into our own spiritual rootedness, right? It's for me again, as a follower of the way, as a follower of Jesus, who said, Jesus said, the question came from his disciples, when have you been to prison? When have you been hungry? When have you needed clothes? He said, when you do it to the least of these, you've done it to me. Yeah. Right. And so that for me, that verbiage coming out of the Gospel of Matthew is key. It's a key spiritual nugget for me, at least, to say to hit, not pause, but go, as it relates to our own activity and activism, and how we are to be rallying, folk to think of themselves and move in higher dimensions, in a higher call for what is right and just and correct and honest in these times.
I like that vision, and I think when I'm talking about how we support the people who are directly victimized by policies, right-wing policies, but also the people who are directly victimized by the more mundane, just sort of standard tax and revenue and budget making policy. I want to tie it to that. I want that comes from a place of love, deeply grounded spiritual love on my best days, not necessarily on every day. And that's got to be first and foremost. It's one of the things I really like. We haven't talked much about the new Unitarian Universalist Article 2. In Article 2, we have historically since 1985, we have the 7 Unitarian Universalist principles, and we've just created a new one. It's been somewhat controversial, but at the center of the new one is love. And that was one of the charges to the commission that put the new Article 2 together. Article 2 really is it's the central statement about what Unitarian Universalism is. And they said love has to be at the center, and love now is at the center. And I've been saying when I preach about it, I'm not entirely sure what that looks like. But I want to learn. I want to learn with my people, and you learn by doing. You learn by loving each other, and then loving the community and loving the world. And when I say I don't know what that looks like, I do have some ideas. I'm not starting from scratch, but they talk about in this new Article 2 the deploying the spiritual discipline of love. And some of our folks don't like that. We don't like the word discipline. I like the word discipline. I think spiritual practice is really, really essential. But I keep saying I'm not sure what the spiritual discipline of love is, but I really want to figure this out. And I think the time is absolutely right to figure it out. This is it's going to be a momentous election, no matter what happens in November. But regardless of that, there's all sorts of things happening right here in Connecticut, right here in Greater Hartford, that need to be addressed, and that need to be addressed with love at the center. And so that's the call. That's the call right now.
Absolutely. Dr. King talked about it. He talked about it in terms of the beloved community, right? That when asked, to reflect for a moment, he pondered. I may have asked, in my haste to want to do something for our community and for our nation as a whole, I may have asked us to run into a burning house. I'm paraphrasing him, and that what might be, as we look forward, and he struggled with these concepts in his last book that he wrote, that was released posthumously, right? He struggled with this. What do we do, to live out our faith faithfully in ways that, one, makes sense to us, but also, two, that actually do more than put lip service on it and put money at it. It is a way of life, if you will, right? And I think not for him, nonviolence was that. It was a way of life. Now, and so in the same way, how are we contending for the faith? In my consecration commitments, vows that I made when I received my Episcopal charge and mantle, one of the things I became, that I articulated, is a defender of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what does that, for me, these are the times where we contend and defend what it means to be faithful. And
Mm-hmm.
and how simple and how novel of an ask for us to just be human with one another, just be more loving with one another, find a way to service not our bank books or not our egos, but find a way to service, through love, people and the causes and the needs of those folk. And do it holistically, not just, here, I put something on it and that's all I'm going to do. No, how does my whole life reflect, and the choices that I make, that I make, that you make, that we make together? And I think, and again, it does have some political implications, but it doesn't just stop there. And that's what for me is of grave concern. That often within the religious context, and of course in the arena for which you and I occupy some space, especially here in Connecticut, it is a political conversation, right? We're asked often to wax eloquently with our legislators and our policy makers and all of that. But there is something to be said to the community and the communities both that we serve. That, you know, I tell people all the time, I have a pulpit. I don't need to get up on one. There is one that the people that have, you know, gifted me and afforded me the opportunity to call me pastor. That I got one. I can say on it once a week at least, you know, and wax how I think and feel and believe. And yet, what does that mean if it's only to the folk that are inside the walls or the space of our faith community?
Right.
We got to be more impactful than that. And I have tried to be faithful to what that means. Ergo, we're on these platforms now doing this very thing. I think there is a way in which we've got to lean into that a bit. And here we are in Connecticut. So we're within 100 days of a critical national election. We have you know, the two at the top of the ticket. All right. And yet for me, what's of concern is what's going to happen in the aftermath, whoever is elected, like you named. 2, what did we do down ticket? And then 3, okay, we're going to get through November. Session starts right away here in Connecticut in January. And it's a long session. So let's hit reset, let's ready, set, let's go. There are things that have to be done. We're doing, I really want to reference what our colleague is doing in securing space for people like trans people to be cared for. What you and your congregation and others have done when it comes to folk who are in the immigration throngs, right? They're trying to figure that all out. Those of us who day for day are struggling for folk who are re-entering society after spending some time away in the criminal, or the injustice system. There, I call it injustice system, and you know, those who are struggling with poverty, who affordable housing, can we get any housing, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are some traditional and I would say some historic spaces where we've got to lean into our faith, and it doesn't really matter what the government does or what other folk do. We got to do, and we got to provide spaces and places and means and ways. And if we believe what we say we believe, for example, for me, you know, I hear the old folk when I was growing up. I know I serve a God that'll make a way out of no way. Well, you know, and I've been witness to that, you know, and so I'm a quote from you know, I get to, since I'm an officer of the Lord's Church, I get to quote some Bible every now and then, and King David said it this way in the Psalms, you know, I once was young, but now I'm old, but I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor the righteous seed begging for bread, as an affirmation. Right, as an affirmation that for me feels like where we got to be to, you know, in these coming days.
That's right. Well, the house is burning, right? And Dr. King, of course, knew it, and I think we know it, and I think a very natural human instinct is to be fearful of a house that's burning, you know, in whatever way it's burning. But I think right now we are called to go into that house and to meet people in their need, to meet people in their pain, to meet people in all the ways that structures and powers that are greater than them have the foot on their neck or on their back, to meet them there and to organize with them, to work in solidarity with them. And it may be sheltering in place. That may be what the ministry looks like. I don't think that's all that it is in Connecticut. I think that is going to be how it is in certain parts of the country. But I think we also have a lot of opportunities within that burning house to do some serious organizing, to work with our partners in labor, to work with our partners in the nonprofits, to work with the different interfaith coalitions that are out there, and to just keep cracking away at all this resistance that's coming from this really, what I would call, right-wing, hateful, prone to violence place, to just keep loving, and from that place of love, confront and organize and act, and to just keep going. Take a break, do the self-care, get the rest when you need it, but then get right back in. And I think, again, that's where we're called to be right now.
Yes, I am keenly aware that this moment, to be faithful, has to call for those of us who sense it and understand the way a bit, right? And now you and I are somewhat elders in this work. We've been around.
I know, I don't like to admit it, but it's true.
We've been around this a minute, I think, I'm leaning into some of our juniors, right? To call on them to help. And y'all can run a little bit, again, I'm quoting a lot of Bible tonight, but passage of scripture says that, God chose the old for because they know the way, but God also chooses the young because they're strong enough to carry the way. I'm paraphrasing, but it's going to take each of us doing what it is that we know how to do, that we are good doing and acting. I'm reminded, I was just talking about this earlier today with some of my students, student leaders, the word community. I was thinking about this, and what came to mind is a book that Aristotle wrote. And when he was talking about, community, it comes to us in English. It's a compound word, com meaning with, C-O-M, and unity, meaning, that which is together, a kind of doing it together. And Aristotle, in this writing of his, thinks of unity in three parts: unity of space, unity of place, but also unity of action. And it comes to mind, in this moment, to say that's kind of a way to begin to think through one of the ways we are being faithful to the space, the place, and how are we moving to act. Certainly, I would also say that my head says you better have some analysis before you start acting. You better, figure out some stuff first, right? But that the time and the place, is a witness, and it bears witness to this moment of action. And here we are, a few days from this national election, and yet, after the national election, we got work to do here on the ground. We got work to do in our townships and in our cities to bring about a more caring, a more loving response to that which has been hate-filled, as you've named it. I appreciate you, brother, man. We've spent about an hour in this conversation, and I got any last word to say?
I feel like I have so many last words. I think if we, I like the statement about community, and it's always true that we're never in as tight knit a community as as we often will say we are, and a very surface analysis will show that in terms of space and place and action, especially in a place like Connecticut. You were mentioning the 169 towns earlier. We have these deep-seated habits of people, lone rangers, and different groups organizing this, different groups organizing that, and so often we're not together. And I think it's worth pausing. It's why I say I have this instinct to really convene people over the next couple months to talk about how we're preparing. But that's always the challenge, right? Is getting people on the same page, getting people not necessarily to conform to a certain agenda, but to be cognizant of people's agendas and what people need, and try to cast a wide net so that folks are moving together. It's one of the reasons I love the Connecticut for All. I think there's a lot of potential there. Labor, faith, and community organizations coming together, and setting a very broad, what they call equity agenda. So if the state could actually spend the money it has, here's how it ought to be invested. But then also agreeing on questions around tax policy and really addressing these fiscal guardrails, reforming them. So yeah, how do we carry out and make real the sense of community? I think that's part of this loving call we're talking about, this being grounded in love, and making sure we're hearing everybody, and making sure we're including as many people as possible, and often some of the not usual suspects, because I think what we're up against are forces that just want to exclude, that want to reverse progress, not just the progress of the 1960s, but the progress of the 1860s. That's crazy that's actually happening, but it is. And so how do you bring, and let's bring a vision for Connecticut, a vision for the country that is inclusive and positive, loving, hopeful, and it serves people. It serves people where they are in need and where they are in pain.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate very much. Let's say we're going to be continuing this conversation.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you very much joining us tonight. Listen, family, do me a favor, like wherever you see this, like it, and subscribe to the channel you're watching this on. Share it, and say Bishop Selders is in some conversations. I promise you, we'll bring some folk around this conversation, and we're going to talk faith, we're going to talk justice, and we're going to talk honestly about a vision, and start the vision cast, if you will, a way in which, at least for those of us here, and in fact across this country, how we might change the world. I appreciate you, brother. Thank you.
All right, man. Thank you so much.
All right, peace.
Good night, everyone.